students online as an attendee so far. And I think all systems are go. So I'm just going to be monitoring to see when and if our others join us, and then we'll start in about 30 seconds. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. So Michael, we'll begin as soon as you have your PowerPoint back up on the screen.
Okay. Oops, wrong one. Okay. Tell me when.
Okay, so we've had Taylor Barnes also join. So welcome to Jessica and to Taylor, who are our guinea pigs for this inaugural Antioch University located webinar broadcast. And the topic today is Introduction to Environmental Management Systems, the basics. And our presenter is Michael Simpson, Chair of the Environmental Studies Department here at Antioch University, New England, and the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Concentration in our Environmental Studies Master's Program, and co-director of the Resource Management and Conservation Executive Master's Program. So Michael, thank you very much for stepping up to deliver today's inaugural webinar, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to try to do this within about 45 minutes, and I always like to begin with sort of framing the topic historically, because I think it's important to realize that there are a number of trends that came together to sort of culminate in what we call an EMS, or an environmental management system approach. So I'm going to quickly just give you a little recent history of sort of events that basically allowed us to start to focus on different aspects of environmental management systems. And I'll start with the first U.S. EPA pilot that in Marblehead and Somerville, Massachusetts, that basically is the first time there was a study done of the solid waste system and trying to understand what the waste was, and how it was broken down in its components and what the potential was for capturing it, realizing that this is pretty close to the point in which the EPA was created as an agency. Also, a definitive event that really got the energy side of things moving was obviously the first oil crisis in 1973. As a result of that, both at the government level and also at the university level, research started in earnest to look at alternative approaches to energy, and actually what we call demand-side management, that is changing the demand of energy as opposed to building new energy production. The big event was the Resource Conservation Recovery Act in 1976. It basically set the standard for dealing with both solid waste and hazardous waste in the United States. In 1976 also was the Department of Energy started looking at demand-side management, and they started to focus on weatherization, basically as the least cost but most effective way to reduce the demand on energy. And very soon after that, a SERI was developed by the Department of Energy, which is the Solar Energy Research Institute, which is still going on today. Another trend had to do with management and efficiency, and by the late 1970s, total quality management had been adopted by most of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States. Just as an aside, this approach, total quality management, was developed by an American. It was taken to Japan in the 60s, and the big resurgence of Japanese industry was a result of TQM, and it finally filtered its way back into the U.S. Corporate sector to be looked at as a way to improving quality management, and thus efficiency and product quality. Then we basically started to look at the commodities in the solid waste field, and the first cooperative market was developed in 1981 that really was more than Boy Scouts paper drives, and really looking at it as a commodity that could be traded and used as back into industrial waste streams. 1987, the International Standards Organization basically created ISO 9000 series, which is basically total quality management, or environment, not environmental, but just quality management for businesses, and set up a series of standards in which they could be certified that they were improving the quality over time. 1989, first statewide composting plan, so organics was then being looked at as a very serious component of the waste stream. At the same time, mechanization of recycling came in. MRF means Materials Recovery Facility, and thus people didn't really have to focus so much on separation because we were mechanizing this aspect of the industry. 1990, DOE energy audit procedure started, and there's a three-tier certification for energy auditing, but it became a standard approach that is actually trickled down to even our school here. 1990s was a big watershed with the Pollution Prevention Act, because basically all the work that had been done on waste and toxics, in 1990 they started to look at multimedia, where they looked at wastewater and air emissions at the same time, so it was more an integrated approach. CTAC in 1991 created a technical framework for doing life cycle assessments, and this is a very important part of how you look at impacts by a corporation, both within their boundaries and then outside their boundaries, both upstream and downstream. 1992, the EPA Energy Star movement was allowing people to look at technology and look for efficient technology. DOE started the Solar Energy Research Facility. It's basically testing new approaches and actually trying to improve the current technology, both in active and passive solar. 1993, executive order to reduce toxics. An executive order is not a law or regulation, but it stands until another president denies, and it still stands right now, to basically reduce toxics in all federal agencies, which included the Department of Defense, which is probably the most outwardly polluting agency in the federal government. Then in 1993 was the Green Building Council, create LEED standards for buildings. So not only are we focusing on operations of a business, but we're also looking at the footprint of that and the infrastructure where those operations occur. In 1996 was the standard for environmental management systems. It's ISO 14000 series. And this basically is a certification process, and if you want to work in the EU or you want to work in Commonwealth countries, a business has to set up an environmental management system to these standards, and then they're judged by an objective third party. In 1997, 20 billion buildings get Energy Star, so in 5 years, of where the Energy Star program started, buildings started to be built and met those standards. In 1997 was the Kyoto Accord, which basically brought the whole issue of greenhouse gas loading, which is another metric that businesses could start to look at to improve environmental quality. And then the concept of industrial ecology and corporate citizenship came in the end of the century, basically looking at corporate responsibility outside just worrying about risk and compliance with regulations, actually looking at more social justice issues. And the Journal of Industrial Ecology basically looked at how corporations could be sited on the landscape to minimize overall impacts to the environment. So if we look at that history, basically it went through sort of 4 steps of analysis, and we are now using that with the environmental management system. The first phase was really trying to quantify, figuring out ways to measure and count and consider what standard is for each industry type as far as emissions, obviously starting with into the pipe solid waste, but then moving on into air emissions and water emissions. The next stage is basically how do you put a price on those, and most of the pricing schemes have been avoided cost, that is the avoided cost of treating these materials if you don't take steps to deal with them, or the cost of pollution control devices. Then these 2 things sort of got pulled into the business sector to look at the business as environmental management is a driver for efficiency, and efficiency means a better bottom line. And so the quantification and the monetization skills allowed businesses to use those tools developed to consider how to look at their own operations to be more efficient, but improve the bottom line at the same time and minimize environmental impacts. And then finally, the most recent is basically bringing in social justice issues into the metrics for businesses, and not just looking at directly at cost or revenue, but looking at what we call secondary and tertiary factors that ultimately impact the sustainability of the business and does impact the bottom line. So the ISO 14000 standards, as I said, is the sort of the most sophisticated approach to environmental management systems, and small businesses probably wouldn't go all the way through the standards to do it. They would do something much simpler, but it is basically a good template in which to start in understanding those standards. And as a result, it's a process. It's not a document, it's a process where basically you start with commitment and policy at the highest levels. You set up a planning step that basically allows you to bring in stakeholders both within the walls of the business and stakeholders that are outside the walls of the business, such as possibly people that live in their area, customers, suppliers, and if it's a publicly traded company, stockholders. And then you basically implement the plan, and then you continually evaluate how you've done over time, and we'll talk about sort of the metrics for evaluation, and then you review this, and if it's an ISO 14001, a third party comes in and reviews your progress to see that you did make progress so that you can keep your certification. Historically, businesses' perspective on environmental issues and sustainability around environmental management systems is sort of characterized by this research article by Stapleton and all, that environmental and corporate social responsibility is, they really only step up to the plate when it's a risk management issue historically, and they really early on didn't view profit maximization is tied to social and environmental effects. That has changed. An environmental management system, the framework that helps a company, it really achieves its environmental goals through consistent control of its operations. And with the assumption that this increased control will improve the environmental performance of the company, and as a result will improve the bottom line. Now, so this is sort of testimonials from companies that have basically instituted, and both these companies are small companies. They have 35 to 50 employees, but One of these companies basically viewed environmental management systems as actually a mechanism for for the first time, organize, prioritize, and identify exposure to risk that they may have. And so it was sort of a way to actually look at the whole company in a way that was different than looking at how you create products or services and then what the profit margin is. Another company basically found that environmental management systems, if they improved work quality and quality of life within the company, they were going through EMSs, they found that their customers, suppliers, and even their lenders, which is really important, viewed them more favorably because they were looking at making sure that they were minimizing their risks as a result of pollutant loading and using natural resources. And then because of this, they increased their productivity and efficiency and thus their bottom line. So if we want to characterize, if you're going to come in and try to sell why a company should look at EMS, you can always start with it increases efficiency and reduces cost. But really there's many reasons why that is, all the way from reducing liability, obviously reducing pollutant loading, minimizing chances for disaster or emergency response, but you're also the system should be enhancing employee morale. It enhances employee awareness of the environment, and it basically, as a result, creates a better workforce, and the workforce helps with the reduction of costs because they're more efficient and more dedicated. With this said, the major cost of implementing EMS is overall labor. Whatever you do to make changes, you're going to have to have people do things other than what they were trained to do, such as manage, create products, clean the plant, provide services, work on the production line. They're going to have a new additional focus. And also, if you're going to make changes, you're going to probably have to be retraining people. And as a result, re-education, retraining is ultimately inherent in EMS approaches. Some of the things that you may want to do requires expertise you don't have, so there's a possibility of consulting costs in order to deal with very specific technical or organizational questions. And finally, there's what we call opportunity costs, that you're spending your money on these first three things, and you're not investing in something that may give you a higher return in the short run. The thing with EMS, it's a continuous process, and so the picture of cost should be on the long run, not on the short-term gain. Now, you may have heard of this term environmental audit, and it's quite different from an environmental management system. An environmental audit actually may be part of an environmental management system, but often what it is basically to take stock of a company's activities and put them in the context of current regulations and seeing if they're in compliance or out of compliance. Many businesses conduct such environmental reviews or audits to assess their environmental performance, but these reviews and audits may identify non-compliance, and as a result, may require some kind of corrective action. But that may not be sufficient to provide a business with the assurance that its performance not only meets but will continue to meet its legal, and actually if they have policy requirements, to meet those policy requirements. So I would say an audit addresses an immediate problem, but may not address the root cause of the problem unless you have to take a systematic approach, and that's what environmental management systems helps you do. A key component is that you have to have a top management commitment, and that commitment needs to really be communicated. So making the environment an organizational priority, what that means is thinking of effective environmental management as a fundamental to the organization's survival. And so when we say integrating environmental management throughout the organization, what we're thinking about is the environment is part of the product or service, the product we create or the service we provide. And finally, looking at problems as opportunities, not only do we identify the problem, but we go beyond and find out what the root cause is the problem so we can prevent it from occurring again. And EPA research into companies has shown that companies showing the greatest environmental improvements have very strong upper management commitment, and this commitment is communicated very clearly to everyone in the company. So you need to define and communicate the overarching company policy around the environment, and there's many ways to do this. They can be complex. My rule of thumb is always keep it simple so that someone can translate it. So something like a commitment to prevent pollution, a commitment for compliance with all applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, a commitment to continual overall environmental performance are ways to do this. And a great test to see if you really have a sort of simple and understandable policy statement is go to any employee and ask them if they can describe it in the intent of the policy in 20 words or less. You know, that's a great test to find out if that's been communicated, it's framed and communicated correctly. Now, how does the organization interact with the environment? So we often in the field talk about two things. We talk about environmental aspects and we talk about environmental impacts. So an environmental aspect are the elements or activities and products or services of an organization that interact with the environment, anything that interacts with the environment. So even the footprint of the building is interacting with the environment. Environmental impact is any change to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, because we're trying to improve things. We want to document beneficial improvements from an organization's activities, products, or services. So an EMS should include a procedure to identify and assess environmental aspect that the organization can control and over which it can have influence if it doesn't have direct control. So example of let me see, back up a second. Okay, example of what we call operational environmental impacts. These are things that come from the operation internal to the plant. It could be on the floor where things occur. That could occur in the management and administration offices. It can occur in housekeeping, who clean the plant, or landscaping around. But the aspects are things like, use of paper and aluminum in the office. In the administration unit, the impact is generation of solid waste. Or you're using pesticides and fertilizers for groundskeeper, and obviously there's a potential for water pollution and air control. If we go out further, we can look at associated environmental impacts. An aspect is that you're outsourcing your manufacturing offshore. Certain parts of your products are being manufactured out someplace else. And if it happens to be in a place where you're supporting unfair labor practices, you have a potential impact. Same way, if you're locating a business in a suburban office park and it's not near where people live, you're increasing employee reliance on private automobiles and all basically the air emission and resource use associated with them. So the question is, where do you set the boundaries of your analysis? And for an ISO 14001, you're supposed to be going upstream and downstream, inside the walls and outside the walls of your organization. So on the, I guess it's my left-hand column, looking at it, is basically one is identifying aspects, okay? And obviously the clear ones are pollutants into the ground, into the air, into the water. Other things are durability of products and how long they stay out there and what impacts the products and services have on the environment. Also, what does the land or infrastructure that the company owns, what impacts does that have on the environment? And then finally, which activities have a high risk because they could create emergency response and corrective action as an emergency. But once you have these, then you need to evaluate your impacts. And so I won't go through all these, but the magnitude or degree of the impact is important, and the frequency or likelihood of the impact is important. So you may identify a lot of impacts, but if it's not likely or it may not have a high magnitude, it's may not where you want to focus your early efforts. So to summarize it, you want to define your environmental aspects. You got to decide if they're under your control or influence. You want to identify any related environmental impacts as a result, and decide if the impacts are significant. And then that way you can start to prioritize them. Okay. As part of this, one of the things you're going to need to do right off the bat is once you start looking at aspects and seeing what the impacts are, you have to find out if your company is currently in compliance with all the overarching federal and state laws. And obviously the leading laws have to do with clean air, clean water, and solid waste and hazardous waste, which is seen here. And then you have things like emergency response and a right to know, which is that is the employee's right to know what kind of environment they're working in. And also, if you're moving materials, it may not have anything to do with your operation, but if your supplier is sending materials to you, or you're moving a product that is deemed hazardous, you have to be in compliance with that. And for employees, especially the non-environmental law, but it really is, it's occupational safety and health. For employees, these are a big driver, and you need to be in compliance with these, and you should be in compliance with these because these are important social metrics to maximize the environmental health and quality of the workplace. So, beyond just evaluating, documenting you are in compliance with existing federal and state laws, EMSs look for opportunities for continued improvement. And what we use, the tool we like to use, is what's known as a process flow analysis. And so I want to take you through that. It's the first place to start if you're going to walk in the door. And I will frame this in saying that you should realize that the people who are creating the product or providing the service of any company you walk into, they're the experts. And so even though you're going through this process to identify aspects and impacts, they're the ones that really understand the process. And so you should basically create a dynamic and a framework that allows people who are on the floor, who never really talk to the president, what I call the real experts. You need to give them voice because they often have a solution, but no one's ever listened to them. So part of what you're doing is allowing them to have a voice through you if you're an outsider as an objective third party. If you're internal on an EMS team, then the team should take that role to give people who could come up with solutions voice. So what is the process flow analysis? It basically is looking at the industrial system. You're looking at every step in the industrial system from a function. It's a functional analysis. You're looking at inputs and outputs, and every functional step along the way. This is one of the sectors I've worked in, is the wholesale food industry, and basically these are functions. They're not places or spaces. They occur within the footprint of the organization, but we're looking at function. And as a result, we're looking at everything from where you store things to where you do things. And the process of inventory is not a place for inventory. It's the process of inventory. And so keep that in mind. So when we're trying to map out an organization, we're doing it from a functional perspective. And then we're trying to really understand what the inputs and outputs are for each of those functions. And so what we call this is a process flow diagram, or a PFD. And it's a great tool in which to get into it. So how do we sort of think about this? So what I want to do is sort of use how I brush my teeth. Not very sexy, but it is a process. We can consider it a service, that the service is clean teeth, and I'm the client as well as the operator. So if we have these steps, these are all process steps in wetting my brush, paste, and toothbrush, using the toothbrush and brushing. In each step, what I want to know is what is the input, okay, for each step. So wetting the brush, I'm going to wet the brush, but the water is going to go off the brush and down the drain. I'm going to put paste on, but I'm not always that great, and so I put too much paste on. Some may fall off, or some may fall out of my mouth before I can use it. In this case, I'm using an electric toothbrush, and so I'm using water, but also I may be using energy. And then I'm brushing, and I keep, continue to use the water. I rinse, I continue to use the water. I brush, I continue to use the water, and I'm using water. And when I rinse, stuff is coming out, and it's water, toothpaste, and whatever that other stuff is, and water. And then I have this electric toothbrush, so I have to use a towel, and maybe I have a pasty towel at the end, which has to be clean. So that's an input-output analysis for each function. And so I want to do that, including energy. Most people just look at materials, but energy has to be a part of this analysis too, because often the lowest hanging fruit as far as cost savings is energy avoidance. So you should keep that in mind. So this is Burdick's. It's a chocolate manufacturing facility up in Walpole, New Hampshire. This is a process flow done. There's multiple steps, and this is just steps 4 through 6. And so there's inputs and outputs, and this is the kind of thing you're trying to get, is just list them all. Obviously, there's also labor involved with this. And labor is important because if you're going to change something, you may actually be using less labor, which will be a savings besides not just using less natural resources or creating less pollutants. So let's go back and sort of look at what are the 4 areas in which we can or 4 categories in which we can look at how we would look at a process flow diagram and how we can come up with areas of intervention. So back to my Michael Simpson's brushing his teeth. So one thing you could do is turn off the water, okay? So I may not turn off the water every place, but I may turn it off in certain places, okay? And so that's really up to me as a consumer, as the client, do I want to enjoy the same experience? I may not turn it off, but there's certain places I can turn it off. So once I turn it off, I'm using less resources. If water can have a price on it, then you're basically saving money. And then as a result, you're also getting rid of the waste. And so you're reducing the environmental impacts of that water going out into the system, and there's going to be a cost for the system to use it. And so what we've done is we made a decision to change our standard operating procedures. So one place we always look at is what procedures can be changed to reduce inputs or outputs or both at the same time. So the first place is changing standard operating procedures. Okay. When you change a standard operating procedure, though, realize you're going to have to come up with a new procedure, and you're going to have to retrain people. So there will be a labor cost to retraining and education as a result of that. It may be simple, such as don't turn the spigot on, or it may be complex for a more complex operation. Okay, so another way, we've gotten rid of some water. Okay, another way is possibly, you noticed I was using an electric toothbrush. So what happens if I go to a manual brush? Okay, I immediately don't use the energy, so an input has been reduced. Okay, and that energy has to offset the cost of the brush of rebuying a new tool. But there's a downstream impact of that, because once I go to a manual brush, okay, I'm changing the technology, and if I'm in a labor-rich environment, where I want to have labor as opposed to equipment, and this is true for corporations, especially in developing economies, there's an advantage of employing people as opposed to having everything mechanized. And so this second area, the first one was change in standard operating procedure. This second one is changing a technology. Changing a technology may be simple or complex. What I found in doing this work for corporations is that, you know, when I see something that might be changed in order to reduce inputs or outputs, the people I talk to on the floor know about. They're up to speed on all the technologies that are out there, and they may say, well, I wish we had this. I've been asking for this for years. And so you want to give that voice and send it up the ladder to, you know, the senior management. But you also need to look at the economic analysis, what would be the cost, the capital cost of buying that, and what would be the payback period from the savings. So, you know, we basically, by going to a manual brush, we've actually removed a complete functional unit. We don't have to turn on anything if we have a manual brush. And so the turning on the electric toothbrush is gone. And so sometimes you actually create a simpler functional flow as a result of this. Another possibility is, you know, I might want to change from paste to baking soda. Okay, so in that regards, I'm putting baking soda on my list, on my thing. Baking soda actually is cheaper to buy than toothbrush on a per unit basis, so I'm actually having an input that's giving me the same sort of cleansing power, but at a lower cost. Now, you need to be careful about this. You know, you need to be cognizant of the client. In this case, it's me who's experiencing the brushing experience. But the client needs to make sure, you need to make sure that whatever input you change, that it doesn't, it basically responds to the expectation of the quality of the product or the service the client base has. So by changing the input, you don't want to change the quality of the product or service. And so you have to be very careful about that choice. So if I change to my baking soda powder, when I look down at the rinse stages here, my stuff all of a sudden becomes less toxic stuff. Okay. As a result, by reducing the toxicity of the stuff, I'm actually improving my environmental performance, and probably if I have to deal with toxic stuff, I'm definitely reducing the cost of disposal. And so this third thing is you're changing your input. And often you'll go upstream to suppliers and either asking them, you know, what's a less toxic input that I could use to have the same function, or you've done your research and you've made your decision and you go up to your supply stream and you say, this is what we want. And they say, well, we can't provide that. Then you say, well, I'll go to someone else. And usually they come around and can provide it for you. And then finally, you want to look at possibly, you know, we've gotten rid of the energy use in the mechanical brush. We got rid of some of our input and output of water. We definitely have less toxic stuff going down there. So the last area is basically, well, if we're going to produce stuff as an output, what are we going to do with it? And so one thing you can think of is closing the loop. And so one example is that you could take this water that normally would go down into a sewer system or a septic system, and basically turn it and redirect it into a gray water system for landscape watering. So in a sense, you're closing the loop and avoiding the costs altogether. And so from our initial process flow diagram with, you know, 4 simple steps, and ending up with recovery on site, you actually could have a major impact, and that all can translate to the dollar in the bottom line. And so we're always looking for changes in SOPs. We're always looking for changes in technology. We're looking for changes in upstream suppliers to provide the same service, and we're looking for changes in outputs. Okay. Realizing with a change in technology, it may require a change in inputs and may impact the change in outputs. Similarly, if you change the inputs, it may change the standard operating procedures. And finally, if you change the operating procedure, it may change the output. So there's some complexity to it, but if you just keep these 4 areas in mind, you can actually go a long way down the road in sort of identifying aspects and related environmental impacts. Now, let's be clear. When we talk about a process flow diagram, we're not talking about the floor plan. This is the floor plan for verdicts. This is where things happen, and those arrows are how things move. That's not how we do our analysis. We don't do it spatially, we do it functionally. And I just want to reemphasize that point. Now, it may be the case that you could rearrange the floor plan to improve environmental performance, but that is something that is a separate activity, and you should really start with the process flow and inputs and outputs. Okay. The other thing you should think about is most companies, when they're producing a service or a product, have a quality control plan or set up quality control steps to ensure that they can maintain the quality that their clients want. And so the question is, where is their quality control? And so that's one thing you should find out right away, because if you can reorient quality control, you may actually improve environmental management. For example, if we're moving material outside the back end of a company, and we're looking at moving materials to reuse, such as recycling through a materials recovery facility, typically a company, if they say, well, we're going to separate our recyclables somewhat before we send it to a MRF, the real quality control is going to occur at the MRF. Okay, and as a result, the advantage of improving the environmental performance of the company is not there because it's happening someplace else. What you really want to think about is quality control at the source. So basically you ensure that you don't mix things that shouldn't be mixed in the first place, and that way less material follows that arrow up to disposal and more material goes to the recycling. So you should consider when you institute quality control on the floor, and that will have a big impact on environmental performance. The other thing is, once you've identified aspects and impacts, you need to quantify. And the reason you need to quantify is because you need to create a metric or a baseline in which to determine improvement over time. And so measuring things, this could be anywhere from measuring on a per unit basis, such as by volume or by weight, to measuring days that employees are not there. And so there's a lot of ways to measure things, but in Tetra Tech, which has done a lot of this kind of work, basically has always had this motto: what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets done. So you might want to consider, how do we, once we identify things, how do we measure them? Okay. Also, we've talked about opportunities for in-house closed loops. And there's many opportunities where you take a product and you put it right back into the system. Perfect example is anytime you're if you're manufacturing something and you're cutting it up or size reducing it, is there any way that you could use it again? Or if you're using a solvent or liquid, is there any way you can clean that and put it right back into the system? And so there's many opportunities for that. And then there's opportunities, what we call industrial ecology or regional industrial ecology, where an output from one operation becomes the input to another. One that comes to mind right off the bat is in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. There is a private concern that takes waste and burns it, and from that burning they create steam, and the steam is piped across the road into a paper manufacturing plant that makes the paper for dollar bills, and they run all their operational processes and all their district heating as a result of that steam. This is a synergistic approach to the landscape for corporations. It's relatively new, this industrial ecology approach. The old Fort Devon military base in Massachusetts is now an economic development base, and the overarching approach to that whole economic development area is firms can come in if they provide an input from their outputs to another corporation that's already there, or a corporation has an output that's there that the new firm can use that as an input. So you're creating a synergistic landscape industrial ecology. It's a little more sophisticated in the thinking, but if you have a organization that has going to expand into multiple plants, they may want to think about where they site these new facilities or plants. And also, finally, as a result, I mean, we're talking about, how far out do you look? How far upstream do you look? How far downstream do you look? How far outside the walls of the facility do you look to look at environmental impacts? You have to make a decision where you're going to set your boundaries, and that's part of the policy and the front end work, sort of saying this is where we're going to stop our analysis for now. We may expand this pie or this circle and go further and further out. But again, you want to start simple and have successes, and then move out. So we want to talk about, once you've identified aspects and impacts, you quantified these, and you put them in the context of environmental compliance with existing rules and regulations, what are the metrics you're going to use, and where are you going to look for them in order to determine the progress of an organization? And so, three areas you start off right away is, one is obviously the operations, so what we call the production floor or the services. And if it's a restaurant, it's where food's made and where food's served, which is a service industry. So you want to go and you start with operations, and don't forget, all operations has housekeeping that keeps things clean. There's a lot of opportunities there, and an associated thing is landscaping for the building itself, and so those two things go in operations, as well as just producing the widgets. And then you want to look at management structures and designs, because you could actually change certain management procedures, such as how things are quantified, how things are measured, how things are communicated, how people are rewarded, and all these can actually improve environmental management of the organization and reduce liability and risk. And then finally, you want to look and get outside and look at environmental and social issues that are within the environs of the operation, and look at things that deal with social equity and economic equality, and how your operation is adding to or synergistic with what else is already on the landscape for a certain aerial impact or footprint. So how do you set environmental performance metrics? So one is you just directly measure them, and we talked about that. Tons emitted, cubic feet of gases released, and often these are post-control. So if you already have pollution control on a facility, you really want to look at post-pollution control, because the costs of the pollution control device is already in the operations, so you need to deal with something that's not there. You can basically normalize this information, such as when you're looking at emissions, you can look at gallons of wastewater per person, because that way you're normalizing a big operation against a small operation, as opposed to looking at two different organizations or operations and trying to compare apples and oranges. So this normalization process is really good. You can do it per person, you can do it per square foot, you can do it for $1,000 of sale. I've worked in hospitals, and we've done it by occupied, a per occupied hospital bed. And so you can come up with a lot of different normalization approaches. You can index your emissions. Basically, you take a baseline year, and then that becomes your baseline, and then you look at improvements over time. You can look at aggregated data, where you're looking at a certain sector in the economy. So if you're looking at another area I've worked in is is car maintenance and repair shops. You can look at what is the standard for that industry as far as emissions and environmental performance, and look at your facility in relationship to what the industry standard is. And finally, you may, through working with your management and developing policy and then working through a EMS team, come up with something that's really important right now. For example, there may be weight given to greenhouse gas loading. And so basically, if that's the case, when you're looking at changes over time, you may be really putting a lot of analysis in that, or you may be wanting to look at ecological footprint analysis, and so that may be a weighted analysis. You may want to be looking at reduction of potential liability, and thus reducing insurance costs. So that might be a weighted thing you're looking at. And so that's sort of a political decision that's done through a group process, and it should sort of bubble up as a result of working with the group. So what are some of the environmental metrics that we use? And these are basically things we've already talked about, water, energy, hazardous materials, what's recycled, avoiding virgin products in manufacturing with recycled products, and emissions aggregate and normalized. Those are things, but you'll notice that many of these costs are associated with these metrics that are listed here. This is because the business wants to be a better environmental player, but you have to do it in the context of they need to do something in a most cost-efficient manner possible. That's going to be a driver. So you need cost. The bottom line is something that senior management is going to be concerned about, but you can solve both with strategic and innovative ways to deal with this. You do have to meet the expectations for the bottom line performance, and even though the head of the company may, or the owner of the company may have a bottom line for performance, shareholders or board members or other people who are associated with the company may have different bottom lines. So you need to have a bottom line that meets all the stakeholders' demands for performance. And at a minimum, you shouldn't not incorporate anything that diminishes the current profit margins of the company. That's probably a good rule of thumb when you're looking at potential institution of options for making things better environmentally. Again, you should put it in the context of time. Maybe there is a cash flow impact over 6 months or up to 3 years, but after that, the payback is so great that it offsets the initial cost if the company can afford that cash flow hit. More recently, companies are looking at social metrics, and some of the things that have been used are listed here as things that you might want to measure that is directly or indirectly in relationship to environmental management and improving environmental management. Many companies are turning to the social indicators list of the Global Reporting Initiative as the place to start at looking at what we call social metrics. And this is especially true for U.S. firms that are have a supply chain that may be in or outside the country. And so not only are you looking at the social metrics within your own company, you're looking at the social metrics of your suppliers too, which may be a second-tier analysis after you've gotten this up and going off the ground. So let me just end with sort of saying the EMS tasks that you should think about in order to move things forward is you need to come up with a structure and assign responsibility. That is, people have to do things. So what is the structure of the EMS? Who's leading it? Who's championing it? who's going to maintain it, who's going to keep the documentation for it, what is the timing for different aspects of it. You're basically building training, awareness, and confidence in the workforce to basically look out to take on these new environmental responsibilities. Again, evidence has shown, but even though they're taking on new environmental responsibilities, ultimately work-life quality improves and the bottom line improves. You need to really look at communication. You need to establish, if they're not there, processes for internal and external communication about environmental management issues and what's being done about them and successes. And more importantly, you need to recognize and reward those who initiate improvements so that basically you create a culture of innovation and improvement where it bubbles up, as opposed to having outside people coming in and trying to tell you, do this here. The documentation, especially if you're going to be you're going to get third-party certification, is really important. But the documentation is also important because it provides an institutional memory about what has happened with environmental management systems. And for new employees coming in, the documentation becomes the foundation for education of new employees that will revolve in over time. You need to basically have operational control. So you need to identify, plan, and manage operations, and this is where you really get into looking for opportunities through the PFD and quantifying aspects and impacts, and then coming up with solutions. I think it's incumbent upon an EMS if there's no emergency response and preparedness plan, and this is really true for small companies because they don't feel they have the resources to do that. If there are environmental aspects and real environmental impacts and they fall under any compliance set of rules, there's a chance for a potential emergency and a great liability, because with often emergencies such as spills or mishandling of materials that are outside the rules, or having operations that are potentially impacting employees through worker health and safety, there's also possible big fines that go with that. And so basically coming up with this kind of plan is incumbent right at the beginning. And then finally, you need to think about how do you create not only a communication system that provides input and creates an innovative culture. You want to create a parallel accounting system that basically takes savings after you've paid for the initial cost of improvements, that those savings, a percentage of them can go to increasing profit margin, but a certain percentage can be set aside in a fund, and what we call an enterprise fund, that can be tapped to do the next steps of improvement that may be a little more costly. I just want to reemphasize the last 3 points, that EMS is a team-building process. So it's more than just going in and doing technical analysis. It's basically building a system, and that system means building stakeholder capacity and building a team and building the expertise of that team over time. Also, EMS is a continual improvement process. It basically, you just don't do it. You basically revisit it. You basically, in your initial planning, state when you're going to try to reach goals by, and at those points you go back and see how well you did. Some things you may achieve quickly, and you can check them off. Some things may be in process. You continue, but at that point, you may want to add what's next on the list that may be a little more complex or expensive. Finally, you need to keep it simple, okay? An effective EMS must, I think, be dynamic to allow an organization to adapt to a quickly changing environment. So for this reason, I think you should keep your EMS flexible and simple. This also, I think, makes your EMS understandable. The simpler, the more understandable it is for people who must implement it. And I think I always use the rule, let success drive success. And so you should always start with the low-hanging fruit. And we often use this when you're looking at options to start with. The question is, option to improve in the environment. One is the degree of impact on the y-axis and ease of implementation on the x-axis. Really, you want the low-hanging fruit, something that is going to be really easy to implement. And it's going to have a high degree of impact. And what that does is one, it shows that the teams can work together and management can see that this is a process that can work, and the company and the participants see that this actually is improving things because you're communicating successes. And so I think I will end it with that and I guess I don't know if I'm taking questions or just stopping.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. So, so that was an excellent overview of environmental management systems, and I want to note that we are at 2 o'clock precisely. We are able to stay for another 10 minutes or so to take questions if there are questions from the attendees. But that part concludes the formal presentation. So if you would like to pose a question, you can go to the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, or if you see the tag at the top, the little icon, the Q&A icon, you can click on that to access Q&A and let us know what your questions are. So I'll give a minute for the attendees to see the Q&A section and to log in any questions that they have. So Michael, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I just want to note on this final slide about keeping it simple that this is very much in keeping with the barriers and benefits model approach to pro-environmental behavior change, and it's nice to see consistency conceptually across those platforms. So I'm not seeing any questions come through from Jessica or Taylor. So I'm going to guess that we don't have any questions. You can also use the chat function if you're having trouble accessing the Q&A. But I think that we will wrap. I'm not seeing any questions. So thank you very much to you, Michael, for the presentation, and to the yes, Krista?
There is a question. I'm not sure if you can see it under Q&A from Taylor.
Okay, it just popped up, but I'm not able to see it. Oh, yes, I can. Yes, I can see it. I can see it now. So let me read it to you, Michael. So this is a question from Taylor, and he is asking, could you touch a little more on the ISO 14001, specifically in the context of our project? Badger Balm is a manufacturing company but has 50 to 75 employees.
Okay. A company doesn't need to be 14001 certified, and for that number of employees, it's large enough that there's enough resources to go through a complete 14001, but there's a cost because not only do you have to go through all the documentation of developing your baseline and do all the analysis, but you actually, once you've done that, you actually have to have you have to pay for a third-party certifier to come in and say, I certify this as the baseline 14,000, the baseline EMS, and this is you've identified the schedule in this EMS when you're going to basically have a third party come in to look at how you've improved. Basically, in the 14001, you're actually setting desired metrics for improvement, and so when the certifier comes back in, they're going to look and see, did you meet those goals? And so often, to start the process, those goals are set pretty low. It's a pretty low bar just to get the process going. There's no need to be 14001 certified if it's not required for the sale of your product. And you can come up with using the framework we just went through, you can come up with a much easier framework that isn't as complex and still move the facility, down the road to better environmental management by creating a system. But I do think the components that you should really work on is that basically there needs to be senior management buy-in, and that's the chief, that's the owner if there's an owner, chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and the chief operating officer. All those people need to basically sign off and saying this is what we are as a company, and they need to communicate that down to everyone in the company, because those people that they're communicating down to are going to be taking on roles to implement the environmental management system. Secondly, I think you need to sort of develop an environmental policy for the company, and it needs to be, as I said, simple and clear. But that policy, and you can actually have goals or objectives under each of the policy statements, but every decision around an EMS should be driven by and people should look back to that saying, is this meeting our overall policy objectives? And then finally, I do think you need to do an initial aspects and impacts analysis to create a baseline for metrics in which to look at over time.
Okay, thank you very much. So I understand that there's one more question that we're expecting, and this is, I haven't seen it pop up on the screen yet, but a response from Taylor. Thank you so much for this information, extremely helpful, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Exactly what we needed for our project. So that's fantastic. And Jess, we'll give you more time to type that question in if you'd like to pose one. And I do want to reflect on something that Michael just said, which is that, about the necessity or lack of necessity about ISO 14001 certification. And Badger, the framework for this particular project, of course, is that Badger is a B Corp and certified by B Lab. And while B Lab adopts many of the same approaches that you have presented, Michael, in this presentation today, I think it is a less complex and more basic certification process. So that's the good news for this project. So I want to wait to see if we get one more question. And okay, something is coming in. Okay. Jess's question was the same as Taylor's. Okay, good. So the question from both our attendees has been answered. So we will sign off, and thank you very much again, Michael, for presenting, and thank you to the attendees for helping us to do this pilot webinar. This has been really helpful. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Okay, thank you.